My name is Laureen Cade, and the day my husband was buried was the day my own daughter buried me too. The church was heavy with silence, the kind that presses down on your chest, and I stood by Merrick's casket trying to keep my hands from trembling. People came up, whispering their condolences, some more genuine than others. But nothing pierced me as sharply as when my daughter leaned in, her perfume sharp, her voice even sharper, and whispered in my ear, "You're not family anymore." I froze. She didn't shed a tear, not for her father, not for me. Talia straightened her pearl necklace, chin high, and walked back to her seat as if she had just delivered a verdict. The humiliation stung deeper than the grief I already carried. I kept my composure, but inside, I was falling apart. The service ended, and the crowd moved toward the small conference room next door. That's where the will was read. I had been married to Merrick for 35 years, stood by him through the rise of his business, bore the weight of every storm we faced. But when Carmel Rhodes, the estate lawyer, cleared his throat and unfolded the papers, my heart stopped. The mansion, our home, was given to Talia. All of it. The jewelry, the antiques, the rooms filled with memories. To me, Merrick left nothing more than a one-way train ticket tucked inside an envelope. A ticket out of the city, out of her life, out of everything. The room was silent except for the sound of my daughter's soft laugh. She didn't bother to hide it. Guess Daddy knew who really mattered, she said, not to the lawyer, not to anyone in particular, but loud enough to slice me open. I swallowed the tears, refused to let them fall in front of them all. By nightfall, I was standing alone on the train platform, the rain pouring down in sheets. My coat clung heavy to my body, my shoes soaked through. People hurried past me with umbrellas and luggage, while I clutched the ticket as though it were proof of how disposable I had become. When the train screeched to a stop, I stepped on board, carrying nothing but grief and shame. Hours later, when the train slowed and I stepped off into the cold, wet night, I expected emptiness. But instead, I saw a man waiting in the rain, his eyes fixed on me. Someone knew I was coming. "Laureen," he said softly, lowering the umbrella enough for me to see his face. It was Oswin Greer, Merrick's oldest friend, the man who had stood beside him through decades of business and brotherhood. I hadn't seen him much since Merrick's health declined, but his presence felt deliberate, like he had been waiting all along. "Come with me," he said, without hesitation. I didn't argue. My heart was still heavy from the funeral, from Talia's cruel whisper, from the lawyer's cold words about a one-way ticket. I followed him silently into a waiting car parked by the curb, the warmth inside a sharp contrast to the storm outside. We drove in silence for several minutes before Oswin finally spoke. His voice was steady, almost rehearsed. Merrick never trusted everything in the will. He knew Talia's greed. He knew she'd turn on you. I turned to him, stunned. He reached into his briefcase and handed me a thick envelope, the kind that feels heavy before you even open it. My hands shook as I slid the papers out. Deeds, titles, bank documents. The words blurred at first, but I forced myself to read them. Acres of land on the outskirts of the city, valued in the millions. A deed to a second mansion Merrick had purchased quietly years ago. And then the numbers on the bank statement, $500,000 sitting untouched. I blinked back tears, gripping the papers as if they might dissolve in my hands. Why wasn't this in the will? I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Oswin sighed, his eyes fixed on the road. Because Merrick didn't want Talia anywhere near it. He asked me to hold these until the time was right. He said, if she dishonors her mother, give Laureen what's truly hers. The words cut through me like glass. Even from the grave, Merrick had known. He had seen what I couldn't admit, that our daughter was capable of cruelty, of turning blood into weaponry, and he had made sure I would not be left with nothing. I leaned back in the seat, clutching the envelope to my chest. My humiliation from earlier, the whispers at the funeral, the smirk on Talia's face, the sound of her laugh when the lawyer read the will, all of it shifted. I wasn't empty-handed. I wasn't disposable. I had been entrusted with more than she ever imagined. But I also knew I couldn't reveal it. Not yet. To speak too soon would turn her arrogance into suspicion. The power was in my silence. I had to play the role of the abandoned widow, the one with nothing but a train ticket and a rain-soaked coat. Let her believe she had won. Let her bask in her temporary glory. I glanced back down at the documents. Land worth millions. A mansion untouched. $500,000 waiting quietly in the bank. My fortune was secure. And for the first time since Merrick's casket was lowered into the ground, I felt the faintest flicker of strength return. Oswin pulled up to a modest hotel, turned to me, and said, "Keep this close, Laureen. Don't let anyone know, not even for a second. Merrick planned this for you." I nodded, slipping the envelope into my bag, my fingers gripping it as though it were my lifeline. For once, I wasn't walking away with nothing. I now held more than my daughter could ever dream of, but I would have to stay silent until her own greed destroyed her. When Oswin left me at that quiet hotel, with the envelope tucked in my bag, I felt the strange weight of two lives pressing on me. The world believed I was the widow cast out with nothing but a train ticket, and I let them. It was safer that way. The fewer people who knew what Merrick had entrusted to me, the stronger my position would be when the time came. So I returned to my small apartment on the edge of town, a space that smelled faintly of old carpet and cooking oil, nothing like the grand Cade mansion. My neighbors offered pitying looks when they saw me drag my suitcase upstairs. They assumed I had been cut off completely, and I didn't correct them. I moved through those narrow hallways with my head low, never letting on that in the bottom drawer of my nightstand sat deeds to acres of land, a mansion deed, and bank records showing $500,000 waiting for me. Meanwhile, Talia was busy painting the city in gold. Within days of Merrick's burial, photos of her smiling in front of the Cade mansion appeared online, taken by friends she had invited over for champagne in the courtyard. She stood in the doorway of the house I once decorated for Christmas, her hand on the brass knob, laughing like a queen ascending a throne. She flaunted her new life without shame, parading around in designer clothes and captioning every post with lines about being daddy's chosen. She never called me, not once. Instead, she let her mockery travel through whispers that reached me easily. A neighbor told me they overheard her say, "Mother always said the house was hers. Guess Daddy proved otherwise." Each word dug into me like a knife, but I stayed silent. I had no need to correct her. At night, I sat in my apartment, lights dim, the envelope open on my lap. I traced my finger across the inked lines of the land deeds, rereading the address of the mansion Merrick had hidden away. I imagined the quiet halls, untouched, waiting for me to walk through its doors. I counted the zeros on the bank statement until my tears blurred the page. And still, I told no one. My silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. If I had learned anything in my years as Merrick's wife, it was that greed always betrays itself. Talia's arrogance was a time bomb, and all I had to do was wait for her to light the fuse. She made it easy. Within the first week of living in the Cade mansion, she began talking about selling it. I heard it from a cousin who'd stopped by, thinking she was dropping in to congratulate Talia. Instead, she heard my daughter telling a real estate agent over the phone that she wanted the property listed immediately, that she wasn't interested in rotting in an old house her mother obsessed over. The words stung, but I also felt something else stir inside me, a quiet, knowing satisfaction. Merrick had thought of this. He had placed that clause in the will for a reason, and my daughter, blinded by greed, was about to walk straight into it. I folded the documents back into their envelope, slid them into the drawer, and closed it gently. The stage was set. I didn't have to lift a finger to expose her. I still remember the day of the will reading, the way the papers rustled in Carmel Rhodes's hands as he tried to keep control of the room. He was a careful man, precise with every word, but no one could miss how distracted Talia had been. She was too busy smirking at me, sliding her diamond-studded phone case back and forth on the table, whispering loud enough for me to hear. She didn't care what he said. She thought the mansion was hers. End of story. But Merrick had been deliberate. In that will was a clause, clear as daylight, that the Cade mansion could not be sold, transferred, or leveraged for the first 5 years after Talia inherited it. It was his way of protecting the family home from becoming a pawn in her hands. Carmel paused to read it carefully, even repeating it once, but Talia had rolled her eyes, tapping her nails against the table, more interested in mocking my train ticket than listening to legal language. Now, weeks later, that ignorance had turned into bold defiance. She hired a real estate agent, had glossy photos of the mansion taken, and even held a small open house cocktail gathering to flaunt the idea of selling. Carmel Rhodes got wind of it and called her directly, his voice sharp, but Talia brushed him off. "You work for me now," she told him, dismissing his reminder as though Merrick's words carried no weight from the grave. I didn't hear this from Carmel himself. Word travels, especially when arrogance is involved. The whispers came back to me through cousins, neighbors, and one of Carmel's assistants who still respected me. They said Talia laughed when he warned her. "Daddy left it to me," she snapped, "and I'll do what I please." It hurt, more than I wanted to admit. That house wasn't just walls and furniture. It was birthdays in the dining room, Merrick's favorite chair in the study, the banister polished every spring. It was the place I poured myself into for decades. And now my daughter, my own flesh and blood, wanted to sell it off like a piece of jewelry she'd grown tired of. But grief had taught me patience, and humiliation had taught me restraint. I didn't need to fight her with raised voices or public scenes. I had learned long ago that the sharpest revenge is quiet, the kind that doesn't announce itself until it's already cut deep. So I made my move in silence. I pulled the envelope from the drawer, not for the deeds this time, but as a reminder of Merrick's foresight. He had known Talia would cross the line, and he had given me the power to act when she did. I picked up the phone, dialed a number I hadn't called in months, and waited for the voice on the other end. It wasn't Carmel I reached out to. No, Carmel had already tried to warn her, and she had spat in his face with her arrogance. Instead, I contacted someone who could make sure the breach didn't just raise eyebrows but triggered consequences. Someone who could hold her to the very words she had ignored that day in the lawyer's office. I didn't explain much. I didn't need to. Just a quiet tip, a reminder of what Merrick had written, and the assurance that Talia was moving faster than the law allowed. When I hung up the phone, I sat back in the dim light of my apartment, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. I could almost hear Merrick's voice, steady and certain. Patience, Laureen. Just patience. It didn't take long after my quiet call for the wheels of justice to start grinding. Carmel Rhodes, calm and meticulous, as always, filed the paperwork to enforce Merrick's clause. I wasn't there to see him at his desk, but I could picture it. The neat stacks of documents, the fountain pen scratching deliberate signatures, the steady rhythm of a man who had no interest in bending rules for anyone. Merrick had trusted him for decades, and now Carmel was simply honoring that trust. Meanwhile, Talia paraded around like the mansion was a stage. I heard about the photo shoot she hosted in the ballroom, posing in evening gowns with her friends, sipping champagne under chandeliers I had polished with my own hands. On the market soon, she bragged, posting online with captions about leveling up, about leaving behind old things that no longer served her. I was the old thing she meant. She didn't even hide it. People at church whispered. Some shook their heads, others clucked their tongues. They didn't tell me directly, but word finds its way back. Talia said she's getting offers from out-of-state buyers. Talia said she'll triple the value her father left her. Every word was salt in the wound, but I stayed silent. I walked into services in my modest black dress, took my seat on the side pew, and nodded politely when people glanced my way. They thought I had lost everything. I let them, because the truth sat folded in the bottom of my nightstand, and the truth was moving quietly through the courts. Carmel's filings triggered more than just paperwork. They set deadlines. They demanded explanations. And when Talia dismissed his warning calls, her arrogance became part of the record. She said she doesn't care about the clause. His assistant whispered once when she spotted me at the grocery store. She told him no one can stop her. I simply pressed my cart forward, nodded, and kept my eyes fixed on the shelves. On the outside, I looked like a widow too beaten down to speak. But inside, I was already waiting for the collapse. At a community luncheon a week later, I sat at a round table with women I had known for decades. They were kind, offering condolences still, but I could feel the undertone of pity. Across town, my daughter was draped in designer silk, planning cocktail parties under the roof I had once guarded. The contrast wasn't lost on me, yet I didn't correct their assumptions, didn't reveal my secret fortune. I simply smiled past the breadbasket and let time keep moving. Then it came. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the city skyline, a courier stepped up the marble stairs of the Cade mansion with a crisp envelope in hand. The gate had been left open, guests' cars still parked in the circular driveway. Music thumped faintly from inside. He walked straight to the double doors, rang the bell, and waited. When no one answered quickly enough, he slid the notice under the crack of the heavy wood and left. The paper, stamped with legal seals, declared in no uncertain terms the Cade mansion was under review for breach of will. Any attempt to sell, list, or profit from the estate was void. Effective immediately, ownership was subject to seizure. Talia didn't know it yet. She was inside, laughing with her friends, bragging about offers that would never come. But the notice lay waiting at her front door, quiet as a coiled snake. The thing about arrogance is that it blinds you until the very last second. When Talia finally picked up that notice off the marble floor, she thought it was a joke, some clerical error she could brush away with a wave of her manicured hand. But the law doesn't bend for pride. Carmel Rhodes's filings had done their work, and within days, the authority of the court carried weight heavier than her laughter. I wasn't there in person when the officials arrived at the Cade mansion, but I heard every detail. A black SUV pulled into the driveway mid-morning, papers in hand. They wore no expressions, just the blank professionalism of people accustomed to ending illusions. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, watching men in tailored suits and badges step past the gates Talia had thrown open for parties only weeks earlier. She tried to fight, of course. "This is my house," she shouted, her voice carrying down the block. Someone later told me she stood in the foyer, arms crossed, blocking their way like a child refusing bedtime. But the officers didn't flinch. They read her the order aloud, each line firm, each sentence echoing Merrick's foresight. The clause was ironclad. No sale, no transfer, no leverage within 5 years. Breach it, and the house reverts immediately. By the time her voice cracked into desperation, it was too late. Furniture inventories were noted. Locks were scheduled to be changed. Guests who had come to lounge by the pool slipped quietly out the side doors, not wanting to be caught in her unraveling. The whispers spread faster than fire. By evening, the story had made its way into every corner of the community. At church suppers, women leaned across tables, murmuring about how Talia Cade had lost the mansion her father left her. At the grocery store, clerks swapped pieces of the tale between customers. The girl who once boasted about being daddy's chosen was now the girl stripped of her crown before she could even polish it. I sat in my small apartment when the call came from Carmel. His voice was steady, professional, as always, but I could hear the undercurrent of finality. "Mrs. Cade, the court has enforced the forfeiture clause. The mansion no longer belongs to your daughter." My fingers tightened around the phone. "And now?" I asked quietly, though I already knew. He cleared his throat, and for the first time in weeks, a sentence felt like justice. "By the stipulations of Merrick Cade's will, the property passes directly to you." The words washed over me, slow and deliberate. The same mansion where I had been told I was no longer family, the same front door my daughter had shut in my face with laughter. It was mine again, not by begging, not by pleading, but by the very arrogance that had driven her to break the rules. I thanked Carmel, hung up the phone, and sat back in silence. Outside my window, children played in the street, their laughter rising above the hum of traffic. No one passing by would know that a war had just shifted in my favor. I didn't cheer. I didn't cry. I simply breathed in the stillness and whispered Merrick's name. Even in death, he had made sure I would not be cast aside. The day I walked back into the Cade mansion, the sky was bright but cool, the kind of weather that makes the air feel lighter than it should. A locksmith had already been through, replacing the locks Carmel ordered changed. The gates, once flung open for Talia's parties, swung back with a deliberate creak as I stepped inside. My heels clicked against the stone pathway, the same path I had swept countless times in years gone by. The front doors loomed tall, familiar yet distant, as though they belonged to another life entirely. when the key turned smoothly in the lock and the doors opened. The scent hit me first. Polish, flowers, the faint trace of Merrick's cologne embedded in the wood. I stood in the foyer, my hand pressed against the banister I had once run a cloth over every Saturday morning, and for a moment the silence roared louder than any memory. Every room held ghosts. The dining table where we celebrated anniversaries. The study where Merrick fell asleep with books spread wide across his chest. The kitchen where I had once taught Talia to stir batter, her small hands sticky with sugar before she learned how to weaponize her charm. Walking through each space felt like both a wound and a triumph. This was mine again. Not by chance, not by pity, by Merrick's design, and by Talia's arrogance. I paused at the window overlooking the garden, watching the wind ripple through the hydrangeas I had planted with my own hands. For the first time since Merrick's coffin was lowered, I felt something close to peace. But peace has a way of being interrupted. I heard the gate clang shut behind me and footsteps rushing up the drive. When I opened the door again, there was Talia. Her hair was undone, her face bare, the polished veneer stripped away. She looked smaller, fragile, nothing like the woman who had stood at her father's funeral with laughter in her throat. "Mother," she said, her voice cracking. She reached for the gate, but stopped short, staring at me with wide, desperate eyes. "Please, don't do this. Don't shut me out." Her voice carried down the block, but I didn't step forward. The same daughter who once whispered in my ear that I was no longer family now begged at the very door she had mocked me from. She had come back humbled, stripped, desperate for a place inside. I gripped the edge of the door, my silence heavier than any words I could throw. Behind me, the house waited, the rooms, the memories, the life I had rebuilt in patience. In front of me stood the daughter who had tried to erase me, her arrogance turned to ash. She pleaded again, her voice shaking. "Just let me stay, even for a night. I have nowhere else to go." But I didn't move. I didn't soften. I let the moment stretch long enough for her to feel its weight, long enough for the echoes of her own cruelty to return to her ears. Then, without a word, I closed the door. The latch clicked into place, final and sharp. On the other side, I heard her sobs. But inside, I stood tall in the quiet. After I closed the door on Talia, the echoes of her pleading followed me through the halls, but I didn't flinch. I had learned long ago that not every cry deserved an answer. And soon enough, the consequences of her arrogance began to settle over her like a storm cloud she couldn't outrun. Word spread quickly, not because I said a thing, but because people notice when the mighty fall. The same neighbors who once flocked to her parties whispered behind her back now. The women who toasted her in champagne flutes were nowhere to be found. Invitations she once boasted about stopped coming. Even the real estate agent who had eagerly toured the mansion suddenly stopped answering her calls. Her pride was the first thing to go. The luxury cars she flaunted had to be sold off when bills began piling up. Her friends grew scarce, unwilling to be seen with someone who had lost the very foundation of her status. In the same community she once ruled, she was now the subject of low-voiced pity. I heard she ended up renting a small apartment on the far edge of town, a place where the walls were thin and the neighbors didn't know her name. It was a far cry from marble staircases and crystal chandeliers. A woman who once walked in heels across polished floors was now tripping over boxes in a cramped space she never thought she'd live in. And I stayed silent. I didn't taunt her, didn't remind her of the funeral, didn't parade my fortune in front of her. My revenge wasn't in shouting. It was in patience. It was in watching her undo herself without me lifting a finger. It was in holding my head high while she stumbled in the shadows of her own decisions. Sometimes people asked me if I felt sorry for her. I simply smiled and kept walking. Sorry? For the same daughter who told me I wasn't family at my husband's funeral? For the same child who laughed when the will reduced me to a train ticket? No, sympathy was no longer mine to give. But Talia wasn't finished with her arrogance. Humiliation should have taught her something, but pride has a way of clawing for life even when the body is broken. Instead of accepting her downfall, she decided to fight back the only way she thought she could. I got the news one crisp morning, sitting at the breakfast table in the Cade mansion. Carmel Rhodes called, his voice as careful as always. "Mrs. Cade," he said, "your daughter has filed a lawsuit. She's contesting the forfeiture and trying to reclaim the house." I set my teacup down, steady as ever. The woman who had squandered her father's last gift now wanted to drag me into court, as though the law would bend where her pride had failed. The community would soon hear of it, of course, and they would whisper again, shaking their heads at a daughter too stubborn to learn. The day of the hearing, I walked into the courthouse dressed in quiet black, not to mourn this time, but to stand in dignity. I didn't need flashy jewelry or expensive scarves. My presence was enough. People stared, some with pity, some with curiosity, but I kept my eyes forward. This wasn't about spectacle. It was about truth and Merrick's foresight written in ink. Talia swept in minutes later, still trying to play the role of the woman she used to be. She wore a tailored suit that looked borrowed, her hair perfectly set, her chin high as if defiance could substitute for evidence. She glanced my way briefly, her eyes sharp, but I met them without blinking. There was no anger in me, no fire to meet hers, just stillness. Carmel Rhodes rose first when the case was called. His words were calm, deliberate, and steady, like stones placed one after the other to build a wall no storm could knock down. He held up the will, pointed to the clause, and repeated it as many times as necessary. 5 years. No sale. No transfer. No exceptions. He reminded the court of the warnings he had given Talia directly, the calls she ignored, the arrogance she displayed when she laughed in his face. He laid out her actions like a map, the photo shoots, the party invitations, the real estate listings, every piece of evidence showing her intent to break the rule Merrick had left. Her lawyer tried to argue negligence, claimed she didn't understand the language, that the clause was vague. But Carmel dismantled it all. He produced transcripts of the will reading where the clause was repeated twice. He reminded the judge that Talia had been present, that she had chosen to dismiss it. He leaned on the fact that the language was simple, binding, and legally airtight. I sat still through it all, hands folded in my lap. My silence wasn't weakness. It was my strength. Every time Talia's voice rose in frustration, every time her lawyer stammered under the weight of Carmel's precision, my stillness spoke louder than words. The gallery behind us whispered. They remembered her arrogance, the way she had flaunted herself after the funeral. They remembered her laughter when I walked away with only a train ticket. And now they saw her unravel in a courtroom, trying to claw back what she had already lost. Finally, the judge leaned forward, his voice firm and final. The clause is valid. The evidence is clear. The will is upheld. His gavel came down hard, echoing through the room like a final nail sealing a coffin. Case dismissed with prejudice. Talia gasped, her hand flying to her chest as though the words had knocked the air from her lungs. Her lawyer looked down at his papers, already defeated. Carmel remained steady, gathering his documents, his face unreadable, but his work done. I stood slowly, smoothing my dress. I didn't look at Talia again. There was no need. Her humiliation was complete, carved into the record of the court, impossible to erase. Outside, the air was warm, and the sun lit the courthouse steps. I paused there for a moment, letting the weight of it sink in. I hadn't needed to raise my voice or fight for what was mine. The law, Merrick's foresight, and her own arrogance had done it all for me. After the courthouse, I thought I'd feel finished. The gavel had come down, the mansion was secured, and Talia's lawsuit was reduced to nothing but ashes on paper. But Merrick's plans weren't done unfolding, and neither was mine. Oswin Greer called me a week later. His voice carried the same calm steadiness it had the night he met me in the rain. "Laureen," he said, "it's time we finalize the rest." He didn't need to explain. I knew exactly what he meant. We met at his office, a modest building tucked between two banks, the kind of place no one would expect to hold such weight. He had everything prepared. Folders lined neatly across his desk, the smell of old wood and ink filling the room. He gestured for me to sit and slid the documents forward one by one. First came the deeds. Acres of land, more than I'd realized when I first glimpsed them in the envelope. Some were rural plots Merrick had purchased decades ago, overlooked by others but poised to grow in value as the city expanded. "These," Oswin said, tapping the papers, "are worth millions now. Developers will come calling if you want them to." Then came the second mansion. I had almost forgotten the crisp lettering on that deed in the chaos of recent weeks, but here it was, official and notarized. A home untouched, waiting quietly in another part of the state. "It's in good condition," Oswin explained. Merrick kept it maintained under another name. He never wanted Talia to know. And then, finally, the account. A statement bearing my name now. No longer Merrick's. $500,000. Untouched, ready to be transferred at my command. I sat in silence, my eyes scanning the numbers, the signatures, the finality of it all. For weeks I had lived as though I were the discarded widow walking in shadows, carrying humiliation like a cloak. And yet here I was, holding proof that I had more than Talia could have ever imagined. She thought the mansion was the crown jewel, the ultimate prize. She never knew Merrick had woven a second web, a safety net she couldn't cut through with her greed. She never knew her father trusted me enough to leave me more quietly hidden where arrogance couldn't touch it. I signed where Oswin told me to sign, each pen stroke steady. Land, mansion, money, all shifted into my name, secure and untouchable. By the time we finished, the stack of documents in front of me no longer felt like paper. It felt like armor. Oswin leaned back, watching me. "Merrick always said you had more patience than anyone he knew," he said quietly. "He trusted you to hold this with dignity. And you've done just that." I didn't answer right away. My throat tightened, the grief of his absence rising again. But this time it was softened by gratitude. Even in death, Merrick had known me. He had protected me. And he had seen through Talia long before I wanted to. When I left Oswin's office, the air felt different. The weight I had carried since the funeral began to shift, not gone, but lighter. At home, I sat at my desk with the final set of papers and logged into the bank account for the first time. My fingers trembled as I typed in the information, the numbers appearing on the screen like a final revelation. $500,000. Cleared. Mine. The first time I stood inside the second mansion Merrick had hidden away, I felt both awe and sorrow. It wasn't as grand as the Cade estate, but it carried a quiet strength. The floors gleamed beneath dust sheets, the windows tall and untouched, as if the house had been waiting for me all these years. I walked through its rooms, tracing my fingers across mantels and door frames, and decided right then this wouldn't be a place of secrets any longer. It would be a place of renewal. With Oswin's guidance, I began renovations, not reckless or showy, but intentional. Every coat of paint, every restored window, every new beam felt like a statement that I wasn't the woman Talia tried to erase. Contractors worked while I stood by with folded arms, watching the house come alive again. It wasn't just about bricks and mortar. It was about reclaiming dignity that had been stolen at Merrick's funeral. The land, too, began to change. Parcels that had sat empty for decades were leased to developers and farmers. Offers rolled in, and for the first time, I negotiated from a place of power rather than desperation. I didn't take every deal. Patience had taught me to measure twice before cutting once. But little by little, the value grew, not just in dollars, but in influence. And then there was the money. $500,000 gave me options I had never imagined. Instead of hoarding it, I started giving. Quietly at first, a scholarship for young women in the community, a donation to a shelter that had once given me groceries when Merrick's business was struggling in its early days. But soon the giving grew larger. A wing at the community center, a literacy program for children. I didn't sign my name in bold letters or throw grand parties. I simply invested in people the way Merrick had invested in me, with trust and belief. The whispers in the community shifted. At first, people saw me as the widow humiliated by her own daughter. But slowly their tones changed. They saw the mansion restored, the land bringing new opportunities, the foundations and programs bearing fruit. They stopped pitying me. They began respecting me. Some even admired me. I hadn't asked for it, but the recognition came anyway. Invitations arrived to join boards and advisory councils. My name, once spoken in hushed tones of sympathy, now appeared in print under programs that served thousands. And then came the moment I didn't expect. Talia, still clawing for relevance, attended a gala one evening. She walked into the ballroom draped in borrowed jewels, smiling too brightly at people who no longer lingered by her side. She scanned the program booklet handed out at the door, her painted nails pausing mid-page. There it was. My name, Laureen Cade, listed as a major donor and newly appointed board member of one of the city's most prestigious foundations. She froze, the smile faltering, her chest tightening under the weight of something she could never buy back. She had laughed at me once, told me I wasn't family. Now the community saw me as more than Merrick's widow, more than the mother she discarded. They saw me as a force of my own. The Cade mansion stood silent now, its gates locked and its halls restored to their rightful place. It no longer carried the echo of her laughter, the clinking of glasses at her reckless parties. It was mine again, not for show, not for pride, but because Merrick had intended it that way. And as the house regained its dignity, Talia lost hers piece by piece. Her fall wasn't dramatic at first. It was quiet, almost invisible, the way cracks spread in glass before the shattering begins. Her closest friends stopped answering her calls, and the invitations that once filled her calendar disappeared overnight. People in the community, the same ones who had once crowded her parties, crossed the street when they saw her coming. No one wanted to be attached to the woman who had mocked her mother and squandered her father's legacy. The little she had left began slipping through her fingers. She sold her cars, one by one, each sale a fresh wound. Clothes she once flaunted as designer treasures ended up on consignment racks. The woman who had stood so tall in her arrogance was reduced to carrying bags of groceries into a cramped apartment on the wrong side of town, her heels scraping pavement instead of polished marble. I didn't gloat. I didn't call her to remind her of what she had said at the funeral or what she had whispered in my ear when the coffin was barely closed. I didn't need to. Silence was the sweetest form of revenge. While she fell, I rose, building, giving, planting my name into foundations and futures. The roles had reversed, and everyone saw it. And yet, she still didn't understand humility. Not fully. Even in her isolation, she clung to the hope that I would soften, that the mother she had discarded would take her back. I heard whispers that she told her remaining acquaintances, "She'll forgive me eventually. She has to. I'm her daughter." But arrogance disguised as hope is still arrogance. One evening, as I sat in the Cade Mansion's parlor with the lights dim and a cup of tea in my hand, I heard it, the sound of frantic knocking at the door. Heavy, uneven, desperate. I set my cup down, smoothed my dress, and walked slowly to the entrance. When I opened the door, there she was, Talia, my daughter. Her hair tangled, her makeup streaked from tears, her body hunched as though life itself had bent her in half. She wasn't the woman who had whispered cruel words at a funeral anymore. She was a child again, undone and unmade. "Mother," she sobbed, her voice raw, broken in a way I had never heard before. She reached toward me, her hand trembling, clutching the iron gate for balance. "Please, please, I have nowhere else to go." The night was quiet around her, the street lamps casting shadows across her face. Behind me, the mansion stood warm and whole, its silence watching the moment unfold. Her knocking didn't stop. It grew harder, more uneven, as though each strike was powered by the weight of her collapse. I opened the door wider and stood in the frame, letting the night air drift between us. Talia's eyes were swollen, her lips trembling, her once perfect posture bent into something fragile and unfamiliar. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize her. "Mother," she choked, gripping the iron rail with white knuckles. "Please, I can't do this anymore. I have nowhere. No one. Just let me come in, just for tonight." The sound of her voice pierced me in a way I hadn't expected. I thought of the little girl she once was, tugging at my skirts in the kitchen, begging for sweets before dinner. But that girl had grown into a woman who whispered poison at her father's funeral, who laughed when I was humiliated with a train ticket, who tried to erase me from my own name. That woman now stood before me, undone by her own choices. I let her words hang in the air. I listened. I didn't turn away. She sobbed harder, filling the silence with apologies, promises, bargains. She swore she'd change, swore she'd be better, swore she finally understood. But all I heard was the echo of her cruelty, a reminder of every moment she dismissed me as though I were nothing. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady. Talia, your father warned you in his will. Carmel warned you in his office. Even I warned you with my silence. You chose arrogance over humility. You chose greed over respect. And now you must live with those choices. She shook her head violently, tears flying, as though denial could undo the truth. No, you don't understand. I didn't mean it. I was angry. I raised a hand and cut her off gently. Pride always comes before destruction. That's the lesson you never wanted to learn. And now you're standing in its shadow. Her knees buckled, and she sank against the gate, sobbing like a child stripped of her last defense. But I didn't move forward. I didn't reach down to lift her. I had spent too many years being bruised by her selfishness to mistake her tears for transformation. The mansion stood tall behind me, its lights warm, its walls strong. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a symbol of patience, of dignity reclaimed. And it was no longer hers in any way. I took one last look at her and felt the final thread between us snap. Whatever bond we once had was gone, not because I severed it, but because she had turned me into a stranger long before I turned her away. Without another word, I stepped back into the house. My hand rested on the door for a brief pause, and then I pulled it shut. The latch clicked, sharp and final, echoing through the empty hall. On the other side, her cries broke against the wood, muffled but relentless. Inside, I walked into the parlor, my steps measured, my breath even. My daughter had begged for entry, but I closed the door. In that moment, she became what she once told me I was, a stranger in her own home. Looking back, I understand now that revenge is never about the loud moments. It isn't about shouting in courtrooms or parading victories in front of the people who once mocked you. It isn't even about slamming doors, though sometimes life gives you that choice. Real revenge is quieter, steadier. It's patience. It's the willingness to wait long enough for arrogance to undo itself. At Merrick's funeral, I had been humiliated. My daughter whispered venom in my ear, told me I was no longer family, and laughed when the will reduced me to a one-way train ticket. People pitied me. Some even believed her cruelty was proof that I had failed as a mother, as a wife, as a woman. But humiliation is temporary when you hold on to silence and trust time to work. Piece by piece, I rebuilt in the shadows. The second mansion came alive under my care. The land brought opportunities, jobs, and growth to the city. The bank account allowed me to seed scholarships and support programs that gave hope where hope had dried up. The Cade name, once tied only to Merrick and Talia's arrogance, became tied to dignity and purpose instead. And I did it all without needing to flaunt it. Meanwhile, Talia fell into her own trap. Every cruel word, every boast, every careless smirk became threads in the rope she used to bind herself. She mocked me at the will reading, ignored Carmel's warnings, and thought herself untouchable. But when the claws took the mansion back, when her lawsuit crumbled in court, when her friends disappeared and her reputation dissolved, she was left with nothing but the echo of her own pride. She came to my door one last time, tears streaming, begging for entry. and I told her what life had been trying to teach her. Pride comes before destruction. I didn't shut her out for vengeance. I shut her out because she had made her choice long before. She chose arrogance over family, greed over respect, and now she had to live with the consequences. Revenge wasn't in watching her collapse. It was in knowing I never had to lower myself to her level. I never had to fight her with the same cruelty she used on me. My revenge was in my patience, my silence, and my refusal to be erased. As I sit now in the Cade mansion, the light pouring across the polished floors, I don't feel bitterness. I feel peace. I feel Merrick's presence in the legacy he left behind, not in the mansion itself, but in the foresight he entrusted to me. He knew who I was, and he knew who she was. And in the end, his trust proved truer than her pride. I close my story with this truth. Revenge isn't always fire and fury. Sometimes it's the steady hand that lets arrogance burn itself to ash. Sometimes it's the quiet dignity of building when others try to tear you down. Talia thought she had left me with a ticket and the rain, but Merrick left me something far greater. The last word,